Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. I do have one quick favor before we get to the video that you came here for, and that is very simply this. You see that little red subscribe button below this video? Go ahead, smash that subscribe button. It really does help me. It really does help this channel grow and my audience grow. So go ahead and hit that red subscribe button. And now, here is the video that you came here for. And so I bring it up because, honestly, we're at the point where there really isn't that much left to talk about with the college basketball transfer portal, but it is a good time to reflect, pick winners, and tell you about the schools that had the most success this spring and also the schools that had the success, but what it will mean for college basketball next year. A couple notes before we get started. One, it did feel like there wasn't as much just absolute insanity in the portal as there was last year. Last year, if you remember, Texas signed, I think, 5 or 6 guys. Kentucky signed 4 or 5 guys. You had Kofi Coburn, Marcus Carr entering the portal in June and July. This year, because the deadline to enter was May 1st, it was a little bit less hectic, and picking winners wasn't quite as easy or obvious as last year. But nonetheless, there were still a couple teams, couple programs that I thought really kind of shook up and fixed a lot of the problems that they had. On top of that, what I would also say is before we get to the winners, I do want to set the criteria here. And really the only criteria is this. You had to sign multiple guys. Because I do think there's some schools that had like an individual hole to fill. But it feels weird if you only sign one guy to call them a winner, right? Like Kentucky needed a slasher and scorer. They got Antonio Reeves from Illinois State. Are they a winner? I don't know. They got a player they need. I don't know if they're a winner. Same with Gonzaga and Efton Reed. Same with Creighton and Baylor Shireman. Same with Kansas and Kevin McCullough. And so I just bring it up because I'm kind of focusing on schools that signed 2, 3, 4 guys. As you'll see in a minute, some of these schools needed all these guys. Some of them didn't. But with that said, let's get to the winners of this year's college basketball transfer portal. First off, the number one winner is the guy that is seemingly a winner in the portal every year, and that is Eric Musselman in Nevada. This is a guy that has killed it in the portal since he got to college basketball. It's funny, I was watching the Miami Heat on, I guess it would have been Wednesday night. Cody Martin, who played for him at Nevada, is playing for the Miami Heat. Obviously, a couple other really successful transfer stories through the years at Arkansas since he's gotten there. But obviously, it also is important to note that next year it's going to be a little bit different because they have that super marquee number 2 ranked recruiting class coming to Arkansas. 6 top 100 players, 3 McDonald's All-Americans, so they could be a little bit more picky in the portal. But make no mistake, Eric Musselman went into the portal and got the guys that he wants. And really, as I look back on what Arkansas did, that is what continues to impress me about Coach Muss. He knows what he wants, and he goes and gets it. It was amazing to watch how quickly and how aggressive he was when he saw guys that he wanted. I looked it up. They had 4 transfers committed this spring by April 7th. That doesn't feel like it's that early, but here's the deal. The national championship game between Carolina and Kansas was on April 4th. By the end of that week, Arkansas had 4 different transfers committed, and here are the guys that they have coming in and the impact that they could have next year. The first guy was actually in many ways maybe the most interesting. Trevon Brazile, 7 points per game at Missouri. Doesn't sound as though that's a crazy productive freshman season, but this was a guy that was really under-recruited, really developed late, really came on strong as a freshman this past season, 15 points in an SEC tournament loss. And when he entered the portal, he had a lot of schools really interested. I know Kentucky was interested. He committed to Arkansas. And this is a guy that if you talk to NBA people, they say, look, he ain't there yet. He might not be there next year. But if all goes well, that guy could play in our league. Big, athletic, skilled, all that good stuff. So Trevon Brazile was the first guy they got. Then Jalen Graham, all Pac-12 forward from Arizona State. Really good from about 15 feet in. Really like what he's all about. And finally, not finally, but then they went out and got these 2 kids, Mikkel and Makai Mitchell, who played at Rhode Island. Why are they important to me? I've said it before. Eric Musselman is a guy that if there's something that his team is lacking coming out of a season, he will immediately attack it in the portal or in the offseason. Last year, Arkansas did not have the rim protection that they needed. That got exposed. It really didn't get exposed until the Elite Eight where they played Duke and lost to Duke, in large part because of the success of Mark Williams. what does Eric Musselman do? He goes out and signs the Mitchell twins, who played at the University of Rhode Island. Two guys that really, really played very well last season. It's interesting because we got twins, but they kind of do different things. They each have their own strengths and weaknesses. Mikal Mitchell was the better offensive player, 11.6 rebounds per game, 2.5 blocks as well. Makai Mitchell, 9.5 points, 7.5 rebounds, so he's more of the energy hustle guy. The other one is the rebounder. And so I think Arkansas really beefed up its front court to go along with the talented backcourt players that they're bringing in via the high school ranks. Also worth noting, Arkansas did wrap the portal season about a week or so ago. I think it was 2 weeks actually at this point. Ricky Council, kind of a guard-forward hybrid kid who played at Wichita State, 12.5 points per game. This is another guy. I'm just telling you, I've talked to NBA people that are like, this dude can play in our league. Super athletic, super skilled, and I think it speaks to who Arkansas is going to be next year. I think they're the deepest team in college basketball. I think you can argue just in terms of future NBA prospects, they may be the most talented. Now, some of their high school players are one-and-done kids. Some of these transfers are probably 2-3-year players, but they got a lot of guys with NBA upside. So Arkansas, to me, is the obvious, clear, definitive, no doubt about it, winner of the college basketball transfer portal. 5 players signed, 4 by April 7th, including an all Pac-12 forward in Jalen Graham, and 2 guys that I think have NBA futures for sure, Trevon Brazile from Missouri, Ricky Council from Wichita State, and then the Mitchell twins, who are going to provide that size and rim protection down low. Kind of worth noting, by the way, one thing with Arkansas before we move on to the other teams. I do think it's important to note that with all of these guys, they are at their 13-man scholarship limit. Because of it, Jalen Williams, who obviously was a great player on their back-to-back Elite Eight teams, feels as though he is probably going to stay in the draft, even though, as I record, nothing is official yet. Let's keep going. The winners of the college basketball transfer portal. Number 2, how about my UConn Huskies? And UConn had a very interesting spring. If you follow this, and obviously me being an alum, I followed it a little bit closer than most. But UConn at the end of the season, they were expecting a guy or two to enter the transfer portal. There was a kid named Rashul Diggins, kind of a 4-star kid who didn't really work out as a freshman. The assumption was he might leave. There was this kid, Jalen Gaffney, a backup point guard. The assumption was he might leave. There was even a kid, a cook, big forward, stretch kid, can shoot threes, but has struggled with injuries. Unfortunately, tore his Achilles 2 seasons ago and was never really the same player ever since. So 3 players enter the portal, and everything's kind of like, okay, we didn't want to see him go, but we kind of had to let him go, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And then, out of nowhere, UConn had a kid named Corey Floyd enter the portal that basically sent the program and the fans into a state of shock. Because this was a kid, it was almost like a Shaedon Sharpe deal at UConn. He reclassified to UConn, came there to redshirt, and then after his redshirt season announces that he is going to leave. Dan Hurley, I don't know Dan Hurley at all, but he made some comments that seemed kind of thinly veiled at Corey Floyd. But 4 guys leave, and UConn fans are like, what is going on? Are we in trouble? Should we be worried? Is there something we don't know about? But here's the thing. UConn went into the portal and replaced those guys with better players. First of all, a guy that I've talked about quite a bit on this pod, Tristan Newton. He is a kid who played the last 3 years at East Carolina. If you remember, UConn 3 seasons ago played in the same conference as East Carolina, and this kid blew up against UConn, 17 points, 5 rebounds, 5 assists per game. And listen, I don't claim to be an expert on East Carolina basketball, but Dan Hurley has hinted in his press conferences that he believes that this kid, he's about 6'6", he's a lead guard, is good enough to play in the NBA. Dan Hurley knows NBA talent. He developed James Bouknight. It looks as though Tyrese Martin is going to be an NBA draft pick potentially this year. So if Dan Hurley says this kid is going to play in the NBA, I trust Dan Hurley's judgment. On top of Tristan Newton, the Huskies now went out and got Naheem Aline, a kind of a stretch player, a 3-point shooter from Virginia Tech. Remember, Virginia Tech, of course, won the ACC tournament, went to the NCAA tournament, and this kid was just an elite 3-point shooter for them, about 39% from 3, 10 points per game. And then they wrapped up the portal, although they haven't technically wrapped up, but wrapped up the portal, Hassan Diarra, who was playing at Texas A&M. He was from Brooklyn originally. He decides to transfer closer to home. I talked to my Aggie people over the last couple weeks. Buzz Williams knew about it. Buzz Williams supported it, obviously wanted him to get closer to home. And what's interesting about this kid, he was a backup at A&M. He seems to accept, listen, I might not be starting right away. I want to help this team win however I can. So UConn loses 3 guards to the portal. The fan base is freaking out. And they got basically, I'm not even kidding, 3 players that are unquestionably better than them, 2 who were major contributors on Power 5, Power 6 conference teams that won last year, the 3rd guy, an all-AAC guy at East Carolina. Credit Dan Hurley. He really revamped the backcourt. I really like UConn going into next year. Also worth noting, Dan Hurley said, look, if the right kid comes along, we're not necessarily done recruiting for the 2022-2023 roster. I don't know if that's a reclassification kid or if that's somebody in the portal that we might not know about. Next up, let me give a shout out, and we'll talk about them a little bit and where Aaron was right, where Aaron was wrong. But let's give a quick shout out to my main man, friend of the Aaron Torres pod, Matt McMahon, the new head coach at LSU. And we'll talk about it again in where Aaron was right, where Aaron was wrong. But I was a little critical of this guy when he got there. I talked a little bit about the staff and should they have done this and should they have done that. Because if you remember, when Matt McMahon got to LSU, the entire team entered the transfer portal. So they had 2 guys declare for the draft, Tari Eason and Darius Days, and then 11 players in the portal. And I said, is there a way they could have avoided it? Could they have kept somebody on staff? Should they have done something to keep this core that Will Wade left him more together? Well, Matt McMahon, I was a little worried about, and guess what happened? LSU now has 13 scholarship players. They have replaced all 13 guys essentially that were on LSU's roster last year, and they did a vast majority of this through the transfer portal. Now, I can't say they have fully replaced all 13 guys because to Matt McMahon and his staff's credit, 3 guys returned off last year's LSU team. They all entered the portal, but 3 decided to come back. Mwani Wilkinson, who's a really good role player. Also, Justice Williams didn't get a ton of run last year, but it's kind of a top 50 recruit that has really high upside, and I know Will Wade and his staff were excited about for the future. Matt McMahon gets to try to develop them there. Then there's Adam Miller. I think it's easy to forget about Adam Miller, but he's kind of a former top 30 or so recruit. Played his freshman year at Illinois, was a big part of that Illinois team that went into the NCAA tournament 2 years ago as a number 1 seed. Many thought they were good enough to win the national championship. He transferred to LSU last year, got hurt, did not play, decides to come back to LSU, and I've heard Matt McMahon say, I like this kid, I like his attitude, I like his work ethic, I'm really excited to coach this kid. Beyond just those 3 that came back from LSU, it's important to note Matt McMahon also got 3 guys off of his Murray State team, which won 31 games last year. So if you remember, Matt McMahon was the head coach at Murray State. He decides to come to LSU, and 3 of his best players are coming with him. The most important one, in my opinion, KJ Williams, who was the Ohio Valley Player of the Year. Really interesting story there. He entered the NBA draft, did not get the feedback he wanted. Now he's coming to Baton Rouge, where I think this is a kid that could potentially be, I just think he'll be a really good player in the SEC. I'm not going to sit here and say he's going to be all conference, all this, all that, but 6'10", super athletic, big, strong, physical, can rebound. Also Trey Hannibal and then Justice Hill both came from Murray State as well. And I think that's really important for Matt McMahon because I do think it is going to help him set the tone and the culture of the program that he is trying to establish at LSU. So 3 players returned from LSU, 3 players from Murray State, and then he also grabbed a bunch from the portal. On top of all the guys that I already mentioned, Cam Hayes, a really nice guard from NC State, Kendall Coleman, big guy who played at Northwestern State, Derek Fountain, who played at Mississippi State. Credit Matt McMahon. There was at one point in the summer, he had 0 scholarship players at LSU. All 13 scholarships are filled via the transfer portal, via players that are coming with him from Murray State, returnees, a high school player or 2. But I'll tell you this, if LSU is actually eligible for the tournament next year, I think this could be a fringe tournament team. Credit Matt McMahon. All right, let's keep going, and let's get back to the Big East. Just mentioned UConn a minute ago. Another school that did really well, and I think they're kind of an interesting story about just kind of the where we are in the world of college basketball, is Providence College. And why they're interesting is because, one, they crushed in the portal, which I'll get into in a second. But two, I also just think it's so fascinating how the entire perception of a program, a team, a coach can change in the modern world of college basketball. I mean, just think about it, right? Just think about Ed Cooley, where we were a year ago with Ed Cooley in Providence. If we're being honest, you probably didn't have any strong opinions about him, right? Providence is good. Providence is fine. They make the tournament most years. They don't really advance very far. Just a nice little program that does their thing in college basketball. I can't think of an exact analogy to them, but they're like, I'm just trying to think. They're like Iowa basketball. They have a good regular season. They go to the tournament. They don't do much there. So why do I bring it up? It's because Ed Cooley, obviously, Providence had a ton of success this year. They were the Big East regular season champs for the first time in school history. They go to the Sweet 16, and all of a sudden, everything there changed. First of all, Ed Cooley, deservedly so, gets a big raise. He was pursued at least loosely by Maryland, at least loosely by Louisville. Because of it, he gets a long-term extension, a lot of money to stay at Providence because it's a private school. We don't have the exact dollar figures. But Ed Cooley ain't scraping pennies together from between the couch cushions to go out for a burger on a Friday night. Beyond that, though, you saw in the portal what impact this particular season had. In total, Providence, if you remember last year, actually, their top 6 scorers were all seniors, so they had a lot of holes to fill. They go out and get 5 players that I believe are really, really good through the transfer portal. First of all, I mentioned a minute ago, Floyd, the guard from UConn, was a former top 100 or so recruit, redshirted this past year. He ends up at Providence. Another freshman, by the way, that was really highly recruited, didn't play a ton. This is where Bryce Hopkins from Kentucky ended up. Kentucky fans know who I'm talking about. This kid was former top 30 or so recruit, had a couple really good games, including one late against LSU. Kentucky fans were mad John Calipari didn't play him more, but at the end of the day, he decides to leave. He ends up at Providence. Also, Anthony Carter, all-SEC freshman guard at South Carolina. Clifton Moore, a big guy who began his career at Indiana, then went to LaSalle and was very productive over the last couple of years. He goes to Providence too. And then finally, the guy that I think is going to be the biggest difference maker next year, Noah Locke, who played last season at Louisville, before that at Florida. If you know much about Noah Locke, really good three-point shooter, a guy that was really productive for about 2-3 years at Florida, goes to Louisville last year, struggled a little bit at Louisville last year, but let's be honest. Louisville was a complete dumpster fire. I can forgive him for not being awesome when your coach starts the season suspended, he comes back, then he resigns. It was a total chaotic scene at Louisville. Noah Locke coming in, he will provide plenty of three-point shooting. Finally, what I would say on Providence, which is really interesting before we get to the rest of these teams, what I think is really interesting is they also show you the new way that the portal is being used. And what I mean by that is that I do think when we talk portal, I do think when we think portal, we think of the portal as this place where you go out and get instant impact guys that can come in and have an immediate impact and help you win right now. And that's certainly what Providence did. That's certainly what UConn did. That's certainly what LSU did. All these teams that I'm talking about, Arkansas as well. But what is also interesting about the portal is that you can rebuild and you can stretch things out as far as getting players that can help you right away, and then also players that might not be great in year 1, but in year 2, 3, 4 can develop into real impact players for you. A lot of you have asked me, to go back to the Arkansas thing for a minute, a lot of you have asked me why they take so many front court guys. Well, I don't think they want all 5 of them to start in the front court this year or all 4 of them to start in the front court this year. But a kid like Trevon Brazile is going to be a 2-3 year player that by year 2, year 3 could be an all-SEC guy the way that J.D. Notae was this year. Same with Ricky Council. And now to go back to Providence, it's kind of the same thing. They got a couple guys that are going to come in, instant impact. Clifton Moore, Noah Locke have 1 year of eligibility left, going to come in, play hard, try to improve their professional options, and get out. But Providence also has 2-3 guys that just finished their freshman seasons that are going to be there for 2, 3, 4 years. So it's an interesting thought, kind of thought experiment, but also worth noting because Providence was a winner in the portal, but a lot of these guys are going to be 2-3 year players for them and could have major impact for years down the road. Speaking of years, let me get to a guy that I was pretty critical of. I mentioned Matt McMahon. I was a little bit critical of the LSU deal. Another guy that I was really critical of when he was hired was the Florida head coach, Todd Golden. And if you remember at the time, my criticism was pretty straightforward. For people who don't remember Todd Golden, 36-year-old analytics guy, was the head coach at San Francisco, helped San Francisco make their first NCAA tournament in forever. He gets hired at Florida, and I said, look, I'm not saying he can't win at Florida. I'm just saying 36-year-old analytics guru does not strike me as the guy that you hire when you're competing against Bruce Pearl and John Calipari and Rick Barnes and Eric Musselman and Nate Oates and all these guys. And so I was kind of critical. I said, is he going to be able to get the – analytics don't matter if you don't have players that can make an impact. Well, credit Todd Golden, because he has delivered. As a matter of fact, I think I said it on a previous show, but I joke with my buddy Zach Kroll, who writes for Aaron Torres Online. Everybody was calling him a boy genius before. I wasn't sold. Now I'm all in on Todd Golden, the Florida coach, being a boy genius. I'm basically calling him young Sheldon boy genius from now on because they crushed it in the portal. 3 impact players, 3 guys that I think are going to be really good in the SEC. First of all, Will Richard, really interesting story. Kind of a 6'5", 6'6" wing type kid. Played at Belmont, averaged 12 points per game. He's another one. You talk to NBA people, they say, look, 1, I don't know how he ended up at Belmont. But 2, give this guy a year or 2. He could be a potential NBA player down the road. He transfers up, probably won't be a star right away. But in year 2, year 3, you could be talking about an all-SEC player that really impacts games on both ends of the court. Speaking of instant impact, Alex Fudge from LSU, the second guy that they got, all I'm going to say is just go watch his highlight tape. Has one of the most incredible highlight tapes I've ever seen coming out of high school. Again, another guy that I've talked to NBA scouts about. It's like if this guy clicks, he is going to be a star. He came from LSU, had a kind of a quiet freshman year, but that's not to say that he can't be successful. There was just a lot of really good players at LSU. Finally, the third guy. Kyle Lofton from St Bonaventure. St Bonaventure was a team that 2 years ago made the NCAA tournament. Didn't have as much success this year for whatever reason. But Kyle Lofton's just kind of one of these veteran do-it-all guards, and I just love the way he plays. 13 points per game this year, 6 assists per game. And I think when you're Todd Golden and you're starting out from scratch at a place like Florida that has a history of success, but I think has really struggled the last couple of years. They missed the tournament this past year. You got to get kind of culture guys. You got to get guys that are just going to come in, know their role, veteran, do their parts. Kyle Lofton, the guard from St. Bonaventure, I believe is that guy. So 3 guys at Florida for the new head coach, Todd Golden, who I really like a lot. Kyle Lofton, Alex Fudge, Will Richard. Also worth noting from Florida's perspective, Colin Castleton, their star center, is coming back. I'm just telling you, that's another team. I think they're right there on the cusp of a potential NCAA tournament team. Let's keep this party going. First ACC team, and maybe the most notable team in the transfer portal this year. I got to go down to take my talents to South Beach, baby. How about the University of Miami? The Fighting John Ruizes. We don't know about all their transfer portal commits, but we know that Nigel Pack was very well compensated to commit to Miami. But let's also call a spade a spade. He was well compensated because he was a really good college basketball player last year. So Miami signs 2 guys. The most notable one was Nigel Pack, the guy that broke the internet, because John Ruiz said, we're paying him $400,000 a year for the next 2 years to be a Miami Hurricane and represent my company. Like I said, though, there's a reason he's getting paid, because he was really good at Kansas State. 17.5 points per game, 43.5% three-point shooter. Now, what I will say is, look, I think Nigel Pack's a good player. I don't think he's elite. I don't think he's game-changing. I think he put up a lot of stats on a really bad team. But at the same time, Miami's coming off an Elite Eight appearance. They have some really talented players coming back. You had a 17-point-per-game score in the Big 12. That is nothing but good news for Miami. On top of that, they got another guy that a lot of people really wanted, Norchad Omier, who played at Arkansas State. 18 points per game, 12.5 rebounds per game, was the Sun Belt Player of the Year. Yet another player. Talk to NBA people. He's not going to be a superstar for Miami, but he is a guy that can come in, play a role, has the size, athleticism, skill to potentially be an NBA player. 6'7", 6'8" player. Really cool story. He's actually from Nicaragua. I believe he's the first ever Nicaraguan player to play major college basketball. He is going to Miami. My assumption is he got a pretty sweet NIL deal as well. But listen, the Fighting Miami Hurricanes, the Fighting John Ruiz, is 2 really good players in Norchad Omier and also Nigel Pack. I'll try to be quick on these last few. One, I want to give a shout out to a guy that I think a lot of us have been critical of through the years. That's Georgetown and Patrick Ewing. If you remember, Georgetown went winless in the Big East this past year, this after winning the Big East tournament 2 seasons ago and making the NCAA tournament. The assumption all along was that Georgetown was going to fire Patrick Ewing. Instead, they do the opposite. They said, look, we're going to give you another year, mainly because he signed a massive extension after that NCAA tournament run. But what we're going to do, you're going to shake up the staff. You're going to go get some guys that can help you bring in recruits. Well, what happens? He goes out, gets Kevin Nickelberry from LSU. Kevin Nickelberry helps bring Brandon Murray, who I think is an all Big East type player next season, played last season at LSU. If you've noticed, a lot of these former LSU players are popping up on this list. But Brandon Murray is coming 10 points per game as a freshman at LSU. Real instant impact player, is from Baltimore. I think he's going to be really good at Georgetown next year. Also, just a really interesting story. Qudus Wahab was basically the star player of Georgetown's NCAA tournament team 2 years ago. He enters the portal after last year, goes to Maryland, decides to come back to Georgetown this offseason. Now, obviously, he's going to need a waiver, but I think he'll get it. But all of a sudden, you add a guy that averaged 13 and 10 or whatever his final year at Georgetown back to this team. I'll tell you, Georgetown's one of those teams. They're not, I don't think, an NCAA tournament team on paper, but they are going to make things tough for teams in the Big East. One thing that I think is worth noting at this time in May, as we start to look ahead to next year, the Big East is going to be really, really, really tough. Villanova's going to be good. UConn's going to be good. 3 new head coaches who I think are going to have a major impact. Sean Miller at Xavier, Thad Matta at Butler, Shaheen Holloway at Seton Hall. A lot of talent in that league. St. John's, it's worth noting, added some nice pieces in the portal. Andre Curbelo, etc. But Georgetown is another one I want to acknowledge. I'll quickly go through the rest of these teams. Baylor signed 2 players. One is Jalen Bridges, a forward that played at West Virginia. I think he's going to step into that wing, two-way defensive, offensive role. I think he's going to be really good there. Western Kentucky, I talked about on last episode. Christian Lander, former 5-star that played at Indiana. He is coming to Bowling Green, as is Dante Allen, who had some really bright moments for the University of Kentucky. Last little kind of mid-major team. They're not really mid-major, but Wyoming. I think I've talked about them at various points throughout, but in one weekend, signed 3 players from the Pac-12, Ethan Anderson and Max Agbampolo, both from USC, Jake Kyman, who played at UCLA this past season. And Wyoming's going to be good. Remember, Wyoming made the NCAA tournament last year. They lost in the play-in round to Indiana. They bring back their top 2 players, Graham Ike and Hunter Maldonado, add 3 transfers from the Pac-12. Those are basically the teams that I do think are probably worthy of some acknowledgement. You know, really quick, a couple others. Alabama, 2 really good guards out of the portal. Dominic Welch actually committed late last week. Mark Sears from Ohio. What's interesting about that is that Mark Sears played at Ohio. Remember, Matt McMahon. Nate Oates, the head coach at Alabama, came from the MAC. Ohio is in the MAC. I don't think that he coached against Mark Sears necessarily, but kind of talked to some people who kind of let me know, hey, they know what it takes to succeed in that conference. They believe this is a kid that can come to the SEC and have success. Dominic Welch, another one of those St Bonaventure guys that I think did a good job, kind of finding the right spot for him. Listen, St Bonaventure, I don't want to be super cliche about all this, but I do think that when I look at St Bonaventure guys, really just a school that produces like good players, smart players. They kind of get it, all that good stuff. Those are the teams, I think. Iowa State, by the way, added 2 guys from St. Bonaventure who were really good, Jaden Attaway and also Osun Osunyi, a big 7-foot center. So those are the teams. Listen, I could go on and on, but I've talked long enough. The big winners, in my opinion, Arkansas, UConn, Providence, LSU, Florida with my boy Todd Golden, young Sheldon Boy Wonder, Miami with John Ruiz and all his NIL money. A lot of good teams that I think have done a good job throughout this spring in the transfer portal.